All right, so we're going to get started. Good afternoon and welcome to this event honoring and discussing Professor Jarvis's new book, Decolonizing Memory, Algeria and the Politics of Testimony. My name is Cajetan, Iheka, and I teach in the English department here. It is a pleasure to be hosting this event and to be in conversation with my friend and brilliant colleague, Professor Jarvis later. So first I will introduce her briefly, and then she will give us an overview of the new book for about 20 minutes. Then I will be in conversation with her for another 15 to 20 minutes, and we will open the conversation to the audience. There's a Q&A function that you, please feel free to drop in your questions there. We will get to them. We'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. Now, the introduction. Jarvis is assistant professor in the Department of French, where she's also currently serving as co-director of graduate studies. Outside the department, she's a member of the Councils on African Studies and Middle Eastern Studies. Our event today honors the publication of her first book, Decolonizing Memory, Algeria and the Politics of Testimony, published by Duke University Press this summer. And yes, she's holding a copy there. I won't say anything about the book now because really that's why we're here to discuss it. Rather, I will talk about our other work. Our essays have appeared in high impact venues such as New Literary History, PMLA, and the Journal of North African Studies. In our current project, which I'm very excited about, and I've had the privilege to read part of, Science in the Desert, Aesthetic Cartographies of the Sahara, Professor Jarvis builds a case for how contemporary writers and filmmakers from across the African Sahara transformed the reductive ways in which this desert has long been mapped. She is also a founding member of the Desert Futures Collective, an interdisciplinary research collaboration. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jarvis, who will speak to us now for about 20 minutes.
All right, hello. Cajetan, can you just let me know if that screen is working? Okay, and the sound is working. Excellent. All right, well, thank you first to Cajetan, my good friend and colleague, for that introduction. Also to Marwa Khabour and to Kristen Siebert from the Council on Middle East Studies for putting this together and inviting me to come and talk about my new book, which sort of appeared in the midst of COVID. So it feels like it's a belated appearance in some way. This is one of the first times I'm actually talking about it publicly. So thank you. I'm just going to get started and then we can come around to conversation. So Decolonizing Memory is a book that reads history through the prism of literature. It follows a loose chronology, weaving together close readings of literary fiction with equally close readings of theoretical, juridical, visual, activist texts concerning disappearance, detainment, torture, and genocide that have circulated within and beyond Algeria in the wake of both the long war to end 130 years of French colonial occupation, and also in the wake of the war on civilians that took place during the 1990s and is often called La Décennie Noire, or the Dark Decade, the Black Decade. This more recent war transformed Algeria, which had so long been a sort of beacon of liberation from the anti-colonial period, transformed it into an apparent crucible for the failures of decolonization, a dramatic theater for a supposed battle between modern democracy and anti-modern Islamists, and also a key ally into the Maghreb front of the US-led war on terror. Starting in 1999, when he came to power, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's government passed a series of laws that both legislated a formal end to the Décennie Noire and also more deeply entrenched government authority to justify repression in the name of fighting terrorists. So by way of literature and literary readings, I moved through all of this up to the moment that the Iheka, the massive people's uprising, began in 2019, which is when I was finishing this book. And that uprising overthrew Bouteflika, among other things. All right, so those wars that I named, right, the anti-colonial war in the 50s and early 60s, and what took place in the 90s, neither is truly over yet. And I think that the Iheka demonstrations really made this manifest on the streets 2 years ago. So my book's temporal arc departs from an established trend in both historical and literary scholarship that has tended to narrate Algeria's modern history in three distinct phases, right? Colonization, French colonization from 1830 until 1962, the decolonizing war that began formally in 1954 and ended in 1962 with independence, and then the Civil War. So I take a cue from literary works to foreground out of joint temporal scansions and to help recognize continuities between periods of violence that have been framed as discrete or discontinuous. And also these literary texts, I think, help to illuminate and articulate connections between sites of violence well beyond Algeria's borders. So in the way of a close reading literary scholar, which is what I am, I linger over impasses, disconnects, swerves brought to light by what I call an anarchival network of literary texts, in order to demonstrate how Algerian writers have experimented with and transformed the very peculiar genre of testimony in ways that both defy imposed linguistic and temporal partitions and also dispute the authority of the nation state to serve as the ultimate arbiter of justice. So there's a sort of like a description of the book, but my aim today in about 20 minutes is to give you a vivid sense of it, kind of like a trailer rather than a summary or a series of arguments, because all the arguments are so closely stitched to texts and to intertexts and the way that literary texts talk to each other and to other kinds of material. All right, so with luck, some of you will be enticed into reading this, and hopefully we can talk about it in person one day. So I'm going to start by giving you a sense of how the book opens. Briefly explain what I mean by anarchive, which is not a term I came up with, but that I was inspired to sort of pick up by a friend and colleague. And then I'm going to unfold the story behind the book's cover, which you're looking at right now, right? Because I think the story I can tell about this cover image kind of illustrates the concept of anarchive better than I can explain it. And that concept is like an organizing principle of the book. So then I look forward to conversation with Cajetan, Iheka, my colleague and good friend, and then we'll open up to your questions. So thank you all. I can't see you, but I know you're out there. Thank you all for being here on your lunch hour or whatever hour it may be, wherever you are. So I'm grateful to have this chance to talk to you. So this is one of the epigraphs with which Decolonizing Memory begins. The sentence, which I've translated from French here, this is an English version of it. The sentence comes from a book called Memoir de l'Absent, or The Memory of the Absent, published in 1974 by the Algerian novelist Nabil Farhez. And it's set at least partly in the extraordinarily turbulent situation of Algiers during anti-colonial war. I forget when this part of the novel is set, but 1960-ish. Frantz Fanon called this war the most hallucinatory war ever fought to break colonial domination. And here, as you can see, a parenthetical clause disrupts the syntax of a sentence, Musulman. The term registered the state of exclusion in which colonial society had held us since 1830 and the various legal decrees announcing the decrepitude in which we were to be kept. French Muslims said some, fully Muslim said others, while neither of these two names could give us the illusion of any legal access. And the sentence continues. So this interjection, as if muttering commentary on the strange word, or the French word musulman, which is usually translated Muslim, but I leave it untranslated for a reason, it opens space on the page with this parentheses. We veer away from the narrative present. We're confronted by a complaint that Algeria, under 130 years of French occupation, was ground zero of a uniquely strange juridical regime, whose afterlife has shaped the order, or rather the disorder, of this novel's world. From its legal annexation to France in the mid-19th century until Algeria's independence in 1962, Algérie Française was founded on a legal distinction drawn between French citizen and non-citizen subject called musulman. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but these categories and codes between citizen and subject evolved over time to facilitate state-sponsored violence whose destructive impact has not been fully calculated or worked through, and to create a kind of ghostly status for those living under colonial law. So as the digression in Fares's text here seems almost to whisper, the magnitude of the legal violence that was exercised by the French to colonize and occupy Algeria for so long is such that only aesthetic works, in particular literature, have been able to register its enduring effects in surreptitious and surprising and subtle ways. Like Nabil Fares, many of Algeria's writers have found themselves in the difficult bind of trying to make perceptible what has been forcibly disappeared and of sounding out what cannot be heard, of tracking ghosts in a sense. And I follow their literary responses to an historiographic impasse, that is, how to see or to hear or to make visible and audible what history has rendered ghostly. Right, so above all, Decolonizing Memory makes a case for literature's unexpected, disruptive, surreptitious power to make ghosts perceptible and to make thinkable what state violence has rendered nearly unimaginable. So over this introduction, 4 chapters and a conclusion, I lay out a literary constellation whose center is resolutely Algeria. I foreground the ways that literary texts actually speak to one another and resonate with one another across time between languages. I explore anarchival forms of literary expression that unsettle and elude official discourses and memory projects, both of the French and the Algerian states, in ways that not only rewrite and re-envision the colonial past, but also make it possible to envision decolonized futures. There's a picture from the process. This is back when I was writing it as a dissertation, which it was. I am indebted in this work to scholarship that has established the myriad ways in which Algeria's independence war has indelibly shaped French political and intellectual life, as well as Anglophone literary and critical theory. But my focus lies elsewhere. By taking Algeria to be an important center of aesthetic innovation and theoretical contestation rather than a periphery legible only in relation to France, and by highlighting the profoundly multilingual and heterogeneous character of Algerian writing, the book is trying to expand or help to expand decolonial approaches to African memory. And I aim to help shift some of the spatial, temporal, linguistic frameworks that have to this point largely organized studies of testimony, trauma, memory around Euro-American reference points and theoretical examples. So my sort of point is that Maghrebi African literatures theorize from below, holding out an invitation to radically retrain our political imaginations, to rethink our disciplines and disciplinary formations. Right, so at the juncture where aesthetic imagination meets juridical reason, the capacity of literary representation to contest and complicate reality comes to light. The works that I bring together are not documents of past events, right? It's not about recuperating and restoring the sort of gaps in the archive, so much as they are traces of a collective, open-ended process that is oriented to the future. They are unruly, restless, searching for ways and forms to convey unauthorized truths, and for ways to hold open space to express mourning, grief, unsettlement, fury. These works move in what Leo Brosgal has called an anarchival relationship to the language of the nation state and its laws. Right, so I pick up this term anarchive, which actually originally comes from Derrida, but Brosgal transforms it in her own recent book, which you see here, Absent the Archive, published in 2020, which is about the ways that literary texts and other kinds of aesthetic works have actually created memory of the police massacre of peacefully protesting Algerian civilians on the streets of central Paris in 1961. Right, you can see an iconic photograph right there. It says, "Ici on noie les Algériens," here we drown Algerians. It's a photograph of a haunting graffiti that was written by the Seine after this massacre took place, right? And in the absence of an archive, in the interdiction of any official knowledge, in the face of official disavowal, literary works and other cultural traces kept this history of violence from oblivion. That's Brosgal's argument and what she unfolds. And in her work, she underscores the ambivalent and contestatory relationship of anarchival aesthetic works to state-controlled archives. She writes, "The anarchive is not located in any single text, but it designates a set of works that evince an archival function, and together produce an epistemological system in oppositional relationship to an official archive." Right, so across my book's pages, I chart this kind of counter-archive, right? An archive. It's connected, I mean, it resembles the word anarchy for a reason, an archive. To show how these texts move, how they create ways of knowing and remembering what official histories do not. The kinds of imagination and memory that are kept alive by writing, publishing, circulating, interpreting literary texts in and beyond Algeria have, I argue, created clandestine space not only to protect and to preserve threatened memory, but to nurture and foment rather than neutralize rebellion against the state. So I'm going to move into the story about the cover of my book as a way to give you a real sort of on the ground tactile sense of what the book is up to, rather than sort of giving you an outline. Right, so the cover of the book actually reflects a series of conversations I had with the poet Samira in 2019. And this was the same time I was writing the book's conclusion after all these years, I mean, many years. This was my dissertation, so we're talking like a decade. And after all these years working through these arguments. And she shared this piece with me. You can see one panel from the piece there. And I'm going to show you the whole thing because I think this piece, which she calls 13 Planche Poet, a genealogy, a constellation, which means 13 panels, poets, a genealogy, a constellation, all sort of like a run-on. This piece helps to think through and envision the kind of testimonial poetics that I was trying to articulate in my book. And it gives you a tactile feel for how an archive might work. And then I hope we can open to conversation. I think this is about 10 more minutes. Okay. So in those conversations we had in 2019, Negru shared with me these photographs of this installation piece that she had just created. It was a series of posters, this is one of them, that she had installed as part of a collective project in Algiers during the summer of 2018. So the triangular pattern, as you can see on my book's cover, was picked up by the Duke designers astutely as important, and they sort of took it from this panel from Negru's piece. So we were speaking by phone and by text messages exchanged between New Haven and Algiers and Tunis and Algiers during January and February 2019. And our conversations were taking place like right the week before, I think, the president at the time, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, had announced he was going to run for a 5th term, right, after 20 years already in power. I'd actually met Samira many years earlier in 2014, right around the time that Bouteflika had actually run for and won a 4th presidential term. And I was in Algiers doing dissertation research. So you can see this is a photograph I took on the streets. This is an unbelievably creepy image on a campaign poster, believe it or not, for Bouteflika, not against him, that I saw around Algiers, right? So you can see his eyes like plastered over the faces of Algerian citizens. I'm not sure, there's so many ways to read that, but it's really creepy. And, you know, also picking up signs like this subtle graffiti I noticed on the wall, like a prophecy or a prayer, maybe, for the disparition or the disappearance of Bouteflika, which they've misspelled as Beauty-Flika. At that uncertain moment in 2019, 5 years after these photographs, Samira was speaking to me about her contemporaries, artists, translators, poets, novelists, now working in Algeria rather than in exile. And she spoke with a sense of respect and urgency that she conveyed to me. She said, "We are a miraculous generation, but things are shifting again. They're at risk of vanishing in a new way." A week later, after Bouteflika announced that he was going to run again, the streets of Algeria's cities filled up with tens of thousands and then millions of Algerians in response to this announcement that he was going to run again for office. So the collective demand, and people were then out on the, if you remember, out on the streets every single Tuesday and Friday for the year thereafter. The demand was not just that Bouteflika be ousted, which happened, but also that justice be done for the crimes of a regime for which he was only the symbol, justice which has not yet happened. Memory was being enacted on the streets. These massive manifestations countered decades of disappearance, vanishing, dissimulation. I'm just showing you a few of the images I gathered. I wasn't there. These are from social media and other people during that spring of 2019. And you can see on this poster that the man's holding, it says, "I'm 30 years old, 10 years of terrorism, 20 years of Bouteflika." All right. So much has shifted, changed, disappeared since 2019, 2 years ago, when I finished this book, including Bouteflika, who just died, I think 2 weeks ago. But the demands to remember, the demands for justice have not disappeared. And you can see this reflected in this collage image that was circulating on social media last week in the wake of Bouteflika's death, with his ghostly face composed of the photographs of people in Kabylie who were disappeared and killed during his regime, so during 2001, 2003, and this treaty that no one forgets, right? Not to forget the violence of the Décennie Noire, not to forget that the Décennie Noire did not end when Bouteflika's government legally declared it over. All right. So the paper on which Negrush's installation is printed lived through this entire recent history that I just sketched. It dates, as she told me, from the decade of assassinations, that is the 1990s, and it was given to her by a scientist who had worked for Algeria's Atomic Energy Commission, but who left Algeria when the political situation worsened acutely in the early 1990s. When the scientist returned to the city in 2014 to sell his apartment, right at the time that those campaign posters were around, he discovered these unused reams of paper gathering dust in his apartment, and he gave them to Negrush. And she used the paper to create this installation in 2018 for Les Ateliers Sauvages, like the feral workshop, a public art space in Algiers that was founded in 2016. So you can see the pieces. This is her preparing the panels for installation, and this is what the installation looks like, the whole thing hanging on the wall in the art space. So defying the 13 of its title, right, 13 planches, 13 panels, there's actually 14 sheets of paper in this piece. There's the whole thing. The papers are faded at the edges. They're visibly fragile. You'll notice in the pictures that they were destroyed by the adhesive after they were removed. So they're all wrinkled. And the first 13 are aligned at eye level, directly beside each other, and the 14th is set apart just slightly, as you can see here. Displayed directly beneath the series was a different piece called Bataan Totem that Negrush had created in 2016 with the Algerian painter and engraver Ali Sinem. Sinem is an artist who, like so many artists, intellectuals, including that nuclear scientist, had left Algeria for France in 1991. On Bataan Totem, Negrush's handwritten text, which you can see there, overlays a drawing done by Sinem of ritual symbols that create a funereal rite for the writers and the artists who were killed during the 1990s. This visual textual form overlay is itself a subtle but unmistakable homage to the two foundational figures of modern Algerian arts and letters. It invokes the many paintings that were done by Mohamed Siachem, all of these were done by him, on which his close friend, the writer Kateb Yassine, handwrote verses of poetry, including Les Aveugles, which you see here in the center of the page. Right, so Bataan Totem is an act of generational relay, not just between Sinem and Negrush, but also between an older generation of Algerian artists and intellectuals exiled from Algeria and a younger generation who, like Samira and Negrush, came of age during the 1990s and now live and create in Algeria, where they intend to stay. Positioned next to Bataan Totem, 13 panels, poets, a genealogy, a constellation, communicates Negrush's desire for a new relationship to Algeria's difficult and turbulent past. A relationship that neither forgets nor is paralyzed by this history, but which has digested the pain of loss to move beyond exile, mourning, and traumatized paralysis, that is, to move. As you can see here, each panel of those 13, the first 13, all of them, bears a handwritten pattern in black ballpoint ink. There's a Roman numeral at top, a large triangle at page center with birth and death dates written at either end of the hypotenuse, and beneath the triangle, a fragment of text followed the name of an Algerian writer and another date. So you see here Tahajaout. The first 13 panels, this is a close-up, lays out a series of dead Algerian poets who wrote in French beginning in the 1920s. The 14th panel, numbered with a series of X's, which you can kind of see there, and set apart, addresses in English a future happy Algerian poet saying, "Do not forget, do not overestimate the past." So in this way, the series charts a visual map of Algeria's turbulent birth in the 20th century by way of a literary history, a literary genealogy. We can trace the whole century from 1906 the birth of Jeanne Amrouche, all the way to 2016, the death of Nabil Farez, the writer whose novel, Memoir de l'Absent, I quoted at the very start of this talk today. Right, but the birth and the death dates of these writers do not hew to chronology. The organizing principle is actually not linear, but idiosyncratic and errant. The writers do not line up in order. And although it might seem like it at first, especially next to the Bataan Totem piece, this series is not an homage to writers killed during the 1990s. Just 3 of the 13 in this series were murdered, and just 2 of them during the decade of assassinations in the 1990s. Right, so those deaths are evoked by red ink fragments scrawled inside the triangle, which you can see here. Yusuf Sebti, bullets, night, 27th, 28th December 1993, Tahar Jaout, bullets, 25 years, 26th May 1993, and Jean Senac, knife, point, cellar, summer, August. But others endured different fates. Here are other writers. Amrouche, worn out, Deeb, exiled, Greki, sacrifice, Amrani, tortured, from bone to cartilage, witness to everything. Each panel, as you can see at the bottom on those ones, also contains quoted text that is selected and handwritten by Negrouche and marked only with a year, so that it's difficult to determine whether she cites from published works or from remembered conversations. And Jamal Amrani was her mentor and friend, so it could well be a conversation. It says, "Silence, do not wake me," 1972. All right, all of these fragments are composed in the first person, which creates the impression of a growing chorus of gathered voices of dead poets. You see here Mohammed Deeb in 1961, the year right before Algeria's independence. I walk. The words that I carry on my tongue are a strange herald. Kateb Yassin in 1947, Enna Greki in 1963, Tahar Jaout sometime between 1975 and his murder in Algiers in 1993. It says, there are surely more secure routes. If this is a dialogue, it follows no predictable or certain route. It is not a collective statement so much as it is a gathering together of ghosts and a series of fragments that mark potential and unrealized pathways. Hanging on the wall at Les Ateliers Sauvages, the pale sheets of paper also look something like white tombstones lined up on the wall. And they resemble those posters bearing names of the vanished citizens that still appear, the posters still appear, not the citizens, on the graffitied walls of stairwells and alleyways throughout Algiers, placed there by relatives of the disappeared who continue to demand justice that has yet to be done. So this installation, 13 Planche Poet, is, among other things, an act of public mourning, an ephemeral archive. Negrouche's enigmatic writing on the wall activates the kind of literary anarchive that I am also charting in this book. Right? By its very form, the piece creates a triangulation that invites any viewer who encounters it to participate in an open-ended and generative process of transmission. And there I was, and still am, absorbing her work from afar. She sent it to me, all of these photographs, one by one. And it affected the way that I crafted the conclusion of Decolonizing Memory. It affected how I reread my own arguments and how I clarified them, which made me think and see that literary criticism is itself a part of this anarchival movement that literary works can generate. Just about to wrap up. So a constellation differs from a genealogy in both temporal and spatial ways. Only at a glance does a constellation, right, just as a figure looking up in the sky, appear to be a fixed pattern. When it's examined more closely, its potential configurations are infinite. Its stellar nodes are not inert points, they are dynamic fusions of hydrogen and helium. That is, a constellation is an interpretive pattern imposed on chemical reactions moving at the speed of light. As a formal figure, this also implicates the viewer in a dynamic process, and a planche, a panel, right, like a panel in a graphic narrative, creates temporal juxtapositions that invite connections governed only by our own focus, our own interpretive moves. Right, and these are the last 2 panels of the piece, right? So 13 and then the distant 14th one. And the juxtaposition created here gives a sense of this process of connections, this sort of inheritance that Negrouche is enacting. So panel 13 is dedicated to Miriam Ben, who lived from 1928 to 2001. It's the pen name of an Algerian writer named Marie-Lise Ben Haim, who was both Shawi and Andalusian Jewish heritage and was exiled from Algeria after President Boumediene took power by coup in 1965. She was exiled because of her militant communist political commitments. Right, the citation here, I had the time to catch the last ray of sunlight, is likely drawn from a posthumously published poetry collection, Le Soleil Assassiné, The Murdered Sun. Miriam Ben's lines and the title of her collection allude directly to Jean Sénac, the poet who was mysteriously assassinated in Algiers in 1973, whose name you saw on one of those three with the red markings in the triangle. He had long signed his own work as a five-pointed sun, as his name. Right. So the 14th panel, the one that appears on my book's cover, voila, is numbered with a vanishing trail of X's above a disintegrating series of triangles that appear to be taking flight. It is addressed to the future happy Algerian poet. The dedication actually creates a dialogue with Miriam Ben, by also channeling Jean Sénac. When she spoke at a conference in South Africa in 2011, Samira Negrouche actually closed by reading aloud from a poem that Jean Sénac had dedicated in 1970 to La Poétesse Algérienne de Demain, the Algerian poet of tomorrow, gendered, grammatically feminine. So Miriam Ben and Samira Negrouche have, among many others, answered Jean Sénac's call. So who in the future will respond to Negrouche's open entreaty, do not forget, do not overestimate the past? Right. So in this way, 13 Planche Poet, a genealogy, a constellation, creates a form, an ephemeral material archive, not just for remembering or reconstructing a past and a genealogy of literary inheritance, but also for imagining and creating a future Algerian genealogy as an infinite constellation whose unpredictable movements are also a source of dynamic and luminous potential. All right, I'm going to stop here because I've just noticed the time to open to questions with my colleague Cajetan, and we'll carry on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, for that wonderful presentation. I remember reading in your book about, there's this line in the introduction where you write, haunted and haunting testimonial poetics. And I think, this presentation, the images and your analysis of them, convey that sense of a haunted and haunting testimonial poetics. So thank you so much for doing this important work. I wanted to, the first question I have, and I think, comes out of your presentation, that's the image of your desk, while writing the book. Yeah, if you can tell us a little bit about, the history of the book, a biography of the book. How did it come to be? Why memory? Why Algeria? Whatever you can tell us about that process.
Thank you for asking. I'm sort of a documentarian or an archivist of my own, in my own right, because I'm always taking pictures of things and then I draw on them. Right. So there are many ways to, I guess the question is where to start that story, because in some ways it's the culmination of 15 years, if I go back to the beginning of graduate school, of reading, learning languages, getting grants, listening to ghosts, and following hunches. So I mean, the very spark point was that a teacher in 2006 put a novel by Assia Djebar in my hands, Amour la Fantasia, and it sparked something. It was really difficult for me to read, so I really needed to puzzle over it and pore over it, and I actually started to translate it in order to try to understand it better. And I just got a sense of a feel for her language and the multiple languages that inhabited and haunted her French sentences, which prompted me to learn Arabic, which prompted me then to apply to graduate school, and it sort of one thing led to another, but my entire graduate education and my desire to go study Arabic and go to Algeria, it was all sparked by actually reading that novel, right? So in some sense, I was just oriented to thinking about the ways that literary texts can just change our, what we're planning to do with our lives. And there are two other things, right? And in graduate school, I encountered Giorgio Agamben's Remnants of Auschwitz, and I was really troubled and disturbed and haunted by the way that he picks up that term, Musulman, that I showed at the beginning of this talk. But for Agamben, it comes from Primo Levi, who recalls the use of that epithet in the camps at Auschwitz. He was at Auschwitz. That sort of, this word, which means Muslim, if you translate it, was the word that circulated in the deranged jargon of the camps and was applied to the most dehumanized prisoners, right? And so Agamben theorizes and thinks about like the paradox of testimony, which is what that book is about. Like basically those who have witnessed the extreme horror of the Shoah are the ones who are no longer here to narrate it, right? But he develops this whole theory of testimony that is based on the figure of the Musulman, and he never asks about the origin of that word, right? And like, or even notices that there's a whole colonial sort of history that opens up if you think about the use of that particular term Musulman at the very same time in the juridical categories of empire, right? So I was a first year graduate student. I read that book. I was super disturbed by that oversight. And I actually wrote an essay about it. And that essay is out there. It's called Remnants of Muslims. And that essay was the seed of this book. And I started to ask, like, what happens if you actually historicize and think about all that Agamben blinds us to? And it turns out that there are two novels by Zahir Rahmani. One is called Musulman Roman, Muslim, a novel, that actually writes that whole history that is obscured by Agamben's theorizing testimony. So that was really the spark point. Was my own being haunted in a sense, or disturbed by that ghost of that word, and following it and finding out that the histories I wanted to think through actually appeared in literary form. I'll say one quick thing, Cajetan, but then I went to Algeria. You said, why memory, why Algeria? There's so many reasons why Algeria, but I really wanted to go. It took me a couple of years in graduate school to figure out how to actually get there. And as soon as I arrived in Algiers, like you can see it in this photograph here, there's this thing called the Maqam al-Shahid, this monument to the martyrs of the revolution that towers over the city. And the word Shahid means both martyr and witness, right? So we're already in a space of testimony and memory. And it was just like, it just kind of blew my mind how materialized and how concretized like the state's sort of ways of memorializing the revolutionary past were. So I just became very interested, I guess, in the problem of memory that became so vivid and complicated the minute I set foot in Algiers. So that's quick. I'll stop. Next.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Because of time, I won't follow up. I'll move on quickly to the decolonizing of your title. Decolonizing is become this buzzword these days that at risk of oversimplification, risking losing the critical edge that comes with the term. Can you tell us about why this term? What it's doing for you?
Yeah, the term is doing a number of things. I really got myself into it by giving the book that title. And I keep close in my thinking always the essay by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And if those of you out there haven't read it, please do. The point being that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is about sovereignty and unceded land. And to use it as a metaphor for just like general social justice projects turns it into like deflates it basically and misses the point. Also, and their point is that decolonization has not yet happened, right? It's something in the future. So, oh gosh, what's it doing for me? A number of different things. I'm trying to think of how to keep this brief because I discuss it in the intro to the book. There's a real sense in which, the idea of decolonization was invented in a particular French way after Algerian independence. And this is coming from a book by Todd Shepard called The Invention of Decolonization, which confirms this point that like real decolonizing hasn't in some sense happened, but the French invention of decolonization as kind of like this inexorable next step after colonialism so that it could exercise 100 exorcise, right? Like 130 years of profound and violent entanglement actually created a form that facilitated collective forgetting, right? And facilitated the French state's longstanding effort to distance itself from its own crimes and its own politics of disappearance. And these practices that the Algerian state has certainly taken up and honed for its own purposes, right? So decolonization has been invented as a way to institute amnesia.
Okay.
And so making a claim that literary texts actually subvert that. And the title, right, there's actually like a present participle in the title, right? So I'm not claiming I'm doing the decolonizing, but I'm saying stop, listen, pay close attention. Literature has a particular way of doing the kind of epistemological and radical work that has that's the gist of it. But
okay, yeah. So there is a follow-up question from the audience that I want to get to because of time. This one is from Nuruddin Amara. All right, is it possible to decolonize memories without obtaining justice and reparation for colonial crimes? And is independence what justice and reparation? Is independence what justice and reparation? How does this question of decolonizing linked to the question of justice rather than memory?
That's an interesting and rich question. I'm glad to see that Nuruddin is out there and would love to pick this up in detail. I think no. I mean, is it possible to decolonize without obtaining justice and reparation for colonial crimes? I think no. And I think I need to sort of carefully say that I don't think literature does the justice, right? It doesn't resolve the issues of the past. Like the claims of literature, the work of literature is subtle and what's the word? Humble in a way. But literature does have the power or sort of have the work to retrain imaginations, to provoke, to unsettle, and to sort of subvert and make space for other kinds of thinking, and to defy the imposed forms of silence and amnesia that are instituted through sort of state discourses, right? So I think it's more like literature can provoke and move and sort of create space for the kinds of work that need to be done.
Yeah. Okay.
So no, I don't think that what literature can actually do is quite humble in that sense.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to remind people in the audience to please put your question in the Q&A. Speaking of literature, it was interesting to me how the book moved from literature. When we got to the conclusion, you had this multimedia come up, and that's it's obvious also from your presentation today. And I wanted to ask, what is literature's relationship to all these other aesthetic modes that you've brought up? And how do you see media, both old and new, transforming or shaping memory studies?
That is a really great question. And I mean, as you know, I've been learning from your work on ecomedias and transmedial works in thinking about some of these questions. But you're picking up, like, there is a real shift for me as a literary scholar that started to happen, I think, through this book. I've always read literary works and other kinds of texts like as intertextual, right? So I treat them all as sort of interconnected. So I read theoretical texts as literary. I read testimonial sort of pamphlets themselves as rhetorical and literary, and then notice the ways in which literary work, like literary fictions, also pick up those genre codes, pick up those intertexts and mobilize them in different ways, right? So I think I've always been reading literary works as open in a sort of intertextual network with other kinds of work, but that became so much more pronounced during this moment I was talking about, right? During the Hirak, and looking at Samira Noguch's piece. And I started to become really interested in other kinds of traces and like graffitis and signs, right? And I also found out around this time, let me switch images actually, like around this time about the history of French nuclear bombing in the Algerian Sahara. So between 1960 and 1966, the French this is like right before, during, and after Algerian independence. The French detonated 17 nuclear bombs in the Algerian desert. And I had never heard this. Like I was doing a PhD on the sort of afterlives of French colonization in Algeria, and somehow I had never learned this, and it just really stunned me, first of all, how obscured and sort of invisibilized that profoundly consequential history was. And then it really also struck me that the way I found out about it was through a documentary film, right? And so it was like so this is actually my new project. So in terms of where is memory studies going, I don't know, but for me at least, memory studies is going in this direction, right? So to the point that like decolonizing is not yet done, this radioactive legacy of these bombs, it's in the bones, it's in the soil, it's in the sand, it's in people's memories. It is so profound and present, and yet there's like no real historiographies of this. The archives have been closed in silence. I mean, this is all sort of unsettling right now, but it really has struck me that aesthetic works, transmedial works like photographs, film, and sculpture, it's almost like, and this is Rob Nixon's point in Slow Violence, right? That there are kinds of violence on such a scale, like environmental catastrophe, that we don't really have narrative frames in which they fit. And so I've just noticed that like transmedial works, like these other media, actually are in some sense necessary, or that people are looking for forms to convey or to create a frame to narrate, not even narrate, but to make visible these profoundly invisibilized histories. So yeah, so this is a real shift for me just in terms of what I'm looking into and where I'm going. And I think it's important for thinking about memory as well. Like not everything makes it into literary texts. So there are lots of other kinds of forms. That's an ongoing question.
Thanks for that. You know, as I said at the beginning, you know, many of us are excited about your new project. You know, after your presentation on campus a few weeks ago, someone texted me that, oh my goodness, they really liked hearing about it, and they want to know more. So I'm not alone in being excited about what is coming. There's some questions here, so I'm just gonna read out a few, and you can take them as you want. Doyle Calhoun writes, could you say a bit about the languages of decolonizing memory and your reading as a translator? That is one. There is another question from Miriam Randall. From your visits in Algeria, do you get a sense of a revitalism in the artist community? Does it seem that Algerian politics are more welcoming to artists and free speech in general? And then maybe we can take the last one really that we have here. From Theophilus Okunlola. Thank you for your amazing presentation, Professor Jarvis. You mentioned decolonial approaches to African memory. I want to ask, what are those kinds of approaches currently in Africa, especially considering that most of the mnemonic practices are often patterned with those from the Holocaust? So yeah, let's take, you know what, there's one other one, you know, which I think relates to this question from Theophilus. What decolonizing theories were helpful to you to decolonize memory? So yeah, I will let you come at these questions however you want, you know, with the remainder of our time.
Okay, I'm absorbing all four of those questions at once.
Okay.
Not a very good multitasker, so advance forgiveness begged if I miss your question, but I'll come back to it. I'll go in order with the first question from Doyle about languages. And I mean, there are other people who are doing incredible work in this area, sort of thinking about, and I think this is crucial for anyone who studies, I mean, anywhere in Africa, but in North Africa in particular, such a profoundly multilingual space, right? It's not obviously not just French. It's also not just Arabic, or not just one sort of register of Arabic, because there's the formal Fusha and also Darija, spoken forms of Arabic, and then the Amazigh languages, that's also called Berber, right? So like a whole range of variations of Amazigh languages like Kabyle and Shawiya and Tamashek. And I think that it is absolutely vital to center this heterogeneous, like this multilingual sort of space. And people like Brahim El-Gabli and, oh my goodness, it's just because I'm talking that I can't remember, the Literary Quran, another text that really thinks about multilingualism in literary texts. I wanted to signal those because I've learned so much from them. And my approach in this book was to, even when reading novels in French, really recognize and highlight and amplify the multilingualism and the multiple languages that haunt the French, right? So in reading Yamina Meshakra, for example, the way that Shawi, which is a language that writer knew as a child and forgot, the way that the language haunts and moves through her French. The same with Zahir Rahmani, who is thinking through Kabyle and bringing in Kabyle narrative genres into her work. So on the level of French, just like recognizing that French is not French, it's Algerian in these texts, and it is used by other languages. And I also work with Arabic material, like from Wassini Larej, an Arabic novel that itself channels just an incredible range of intertexts, including Kabyle material and French material, right? And makes Arabic itself into a sort of capacious literary language that is inhabited by the languages of others. So I just think that like that approach to close reading for me has just like, that's where the argument comes from, is from noticing actually a number of those articulations. I have limitations in the sense that I'm not a native speaker of many of these languages and like only have brushing acquaintance with like Kabyle or Shawiya, but really try to recognize their presence. So that's a brief word on languages. Time is flying, isn't it? There was another question about the vitality of artistic practice in Algeria, if I understood. And I want to just say too, before I answer this question, I haven't been to Algeria for a long time because I was doing research there during my dissertation time. So I think 2014, 15, 16, spent a long time in Algeria. And the like artistic aesthetic practices were incredibly vital and rich and magnificent. Like that's what I spent my time doing in Algiers, was going to a number of different artistic spaces and events. But since then, I haven't been granted visas to go to Algeria each time I've applied. So it's difficult for me to say anything meaningful about the last several years, in particular, since the incredible, well, I mean, since COVID and the repressions that have followed in the wake of Iraq. So I hesitate to say more, actually. But I do want to say that just in terms of like aesthetic production and theoretical innovation, Algerian writers throughout the century have been, I mean, transformative and have transformed sort of the literary, sort of transnational literary landscape. I don't know that I caught the question about mnemonic practices and decolonial approaches in Africa more broadly, but I'm intrigued by it. And I also missed the last question, so maybe you could remind me.
Okay, yeah, so I think both of them are asking what decolonizing theories, decolonizing approaches to African memory. I think that's really the gist of both questions. What are those approaches? What are the approaches currently in Africa? Yeah, so I think that's those are the one just came in very quickly. Maybe I can read that too as you think about the last two. This is from Jonas Elbusti. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. I read your book and it's absolutely fascinating. I like how you talk about literature as a training of imagination, past Spivak. I'll get to the question. Could you say more about it here? How it assists memory from temporal and spatial frames. Could you also speak about your method and approach in terms of text selection?
Yes.
Yeah.
Both of those are such good questions, and I know Jonas, so I hope we can talk about this at length. Not on this strange space, but about decolonizing approaches. There's so much to say, and there's so much great work, I think, being done. I mean, Cajetan, I'm such an admirer of your work, for instance. But I think, I mean, one thing is just that how do we say, like literary texts have, like in post-colonial literary studies, I mean, there's been a sort of negative trend a trend that I am working against, to treat literary works and literary productions from the so-called third world or from African spaces as, in some sense, like illustrations or case studies, or just like ways to bolster theoretical enterprises or theories that are sort of originating or grounded in European examples, or European and Euro-American theorizing. So I just think it's really crucial to actually take literary texts seriously as literary texts and aesthetic works that are making interventions, and to read literary and aesthetic works as themselves theoretical, and to start from there. So that's one thing. Like what I mean by like these works are already theorizing from below. Like you just have to tune in and really let them change the way you're thinking. That's a gloss answer. There's so much more to say, but I'm actually teaching a course right now called Decolonizing Memory, Africa and the Politics of Testimony, that really takes that up. Like what is a practice of sort of a decolonial approach to aesthetic works from across the continent in context of violence. And then Jonas's question about the Spivak quote, right? So I don't think I'm going to get to the whole question, and I think we need to wrap up soon. But the quote that you're pointing to, literature is not evidence. It is a tool for imaginative training. That has resonated with me, I mean, for years, but she actually spoke that line at a tribute that I organized to Assia Jabar after Assia Jabar died. In 2015. So I organized at Princeton a tribute to her because she's extraordinary, first of all. And we invited Gayatri Spivak to come, and the two of them were actually close friends. And that's how she ends the talk. She says that literature is not evidence. It is an instrument for imaginative training. And she said, yeah, Assia, we hold out for the imagination, right? In an homage and an act of mourning and a recognition of what she had learned from Assia Jabar. And I think, I mean, that's just it. Like literature is not a constitutive project. It's not a sort of, it's not evidence. It's not archival detail that you can just use to sort of like patch up the historical record. It deals in the space of the unverifiable, right? And literary texts sort of hold out an opportunity to the imagination and you can't summarize a novel, you can't like gloss a novel, you actually have to read it, and that process of reading. And she also says something about the like non-coercive rearrangement of desire. I mean, that's what we're doing as humanities educators, like putting texts in people's hands and letting their desires be non-coercively rearranged. So I think that's what I want to say about that line. And most of the lines or the sort of citations or the texts or anything in that work, that book, it's because it struck me, it stayed with me, it resonated. Like I really chose works that spoke to me. I chose things out of love, or because there were ghosts that were bothering me and I wanted to follow them, right? So there was no like top-down selection process. It was very organic, took a long time. And it was a heck of a process to revise, and here we are. And I would really love to carry these conversations into the real world with those of you out there who've asked questions, whom I know, and I know here in New Haven. So I will, I think, wrap.
Okay. Yeah. I hope everyone in the audience will join me to thank Professor Jarvis for researching and writing this book over the many years, and for spending time with us talking about it this afternoon. On behalf of the council as well, I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. Please, we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.